So recording is starting.
Great, thank you. All right, should we go ahead and get started? It's 11:32. So why don't we go ahead and kick it off, Rachel? Do you want me to go ahead and start?
Sure.
All right, so thanks everybody for joining us for our first presentation on ARPContracts, what you need to know and do. And so I'm Amy Jorgensen from Minnesota Management and Budget. Rachel, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Rachel Doherty. I'm with Office of State Procurement.
Yeah, so again, thanks for joining us. Hope you find this useful and feel free to ask questions as we go along here. Just some ground rules really quickly. Please use mute unless you're speaking. You can use the chat function to ask questions, or you can raise your hand to ask questions, and then we'll pause at each segment and ask if there are questions. And just a reminder, again, this is being recorded. So introduction in the chat, please share your, actually, I don't know if we're going to do this, Rachel, just because we know everybody's from DPS. So I think we'll probably skip that for today, if that's okay with you. So for the agenda, at the end of this course, you will understand specific American Rescue Plan Act information, how to procure procurement options for ARP dollars, the importance of contract management, how to use the contract management plan, why a contract management plan is important for ARP dollars, and then effective tools for contract management. So I'm going to start off with an overview of the American Rescue Plan, just so you guys are kind of aware of what we're talking about here. So the American Rescue Plan kind of came to the state of Minnesota in three bunches of money that we're talking about here. So there's a local fiscal recovery fund, which is flexible of about $2.132 billion. That's money that went directly to counties, larger metro cities, and then all cities and townships are eligible for that money as well. And MMB is administering those funds to go to the local governments right now. There's also federal program funds that are program specific. Some examples are Housing Finance Agency got a bunch of money for renters assistance and homeowners assistance. There's also a WIC supplement over the Department of Health. Those are just a couple of examples, but another about $3.5 billion for federal program funds. And then there's the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is a flexible pot of money that came directly to the state, and that's the amount of $2.833 billion, and that's our focus today. So for that $2.833 billion out of the legislative session this year, there were three kind of tranches of money that were approved out of the legislative session. The first one is a state revenue replacement amount of $1.183 billion, and that's broken out between the 22-23 and 24-25 biennium. That will be used by the administration to cover government services of one type or another. That decision hasn't been made yet. There's also at the bottom here 2022 legislative priorities of $1.15 billion. So these are dollars that will be acted upon during the next legislative session, and that will the way that those funds will be used will kind of go along with the supplemental budget process. And we're in the process right now of doing outreach and also gathering ideas from the community at large about how to use those funds. Then the third tranche of money is this COVID-19 immediate response of $425 million, which is actually $500 million, but we've already used $75 million for summer learning for the Department of Education. The money that we're going to be talking about today for your Office of Justice programs will come out of this COVID-19 immediate response of $425 million. So it's kind of governor's discretion for funds. So for the ARP Act overview, just really quickly, we'll talk about allowable expenses under ARP, unallowed expenses. I just want to let you know that the assistance listing number, which is the former CFDA number, is 21.027 for these funds. The covered period, so this is a little bit confusing. I just want to clarify here that so federally, these funds are available from March 3rd, 2021 through December 31st, 2024, meaning that they must be obligated by 12/31/24 and then spent by 12/31/26. However, that $425 million that I was talking about, those were actually appropriated as a group in statute, and they have a shorter time frame to be spent. So those funds must be obligated or spent by 12/31/23. and follow the normal close process. Grants have an additional year to be spent to 12/31/24. And then we have a link in here to that specific appropriation language. So for the funds that we're talking about with you all today at Public Safety, follow the second rule where the funds must be obligated or spent by 12/31/23 And then any grants that you do have that additional year to be spent to 12/31/24.
Amy, a question. When we're talking about obligated, do we
Yep.
mean like it's encumbered on a contract and we've kind of allotted it to be spent?
Correct. Thanks for clarifying. All right, eligible uses for these state funds through American Rescue Plan. All projects must be classified into broad categories, meaning public health, negative economic impacts, services to disproportionately impacted communities, premium pay, infrastructure, revenue replacement, or administrative. So Department of Public Safety did have to fill out a request form for these funds, and our request form actually breaks them down into these categories and actually into much more discrete categories. So every project that will be funded through ARP will go through this process and will be classified in one of these broad categories. So for eligible uses, please see the Department of Treasury FAQs in the interim final rule. And then if you have any other eligibility questions, you can feel free to contact me at MMB for those eligibility questions. Just quickly, ineligible uses, the pension or rainy day funds. You can't deposit funds into pension or rainy day funds. The only exception there, it's not really exception, but just general payroll that's being paid for by ARP, like payroll deductions for our pensions, that is allowable. This is talking mostly about the large, large deposits to shore up a pension or rainy day fund. Federal match, generally the funds can't be used for state match for federal programs, and then no payments of interest or principal. Single audit requirements are fully in effect for these funds. So a little bit different from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, where only selected portions of the Uniform Grant Guidance are eligible, or I'm trying to think of the right word, applicable. For the American Rescue Plan, the Uniform Grant Guidance, all provisions of 2 CFR 200 apply. There is that audit requirement of expenditures of more than $750,000 in federal funds, require a single audit, and then subrecipient monitoring is required. There's also a section on civil rights compliance. Recipients must comply with federal civil rights requirements, and the link to what those requirements are right there. I also put in the chat our copy of the award letter. So I encourage you to take a look at that to make sure that you have when you're doing your contracts and grant contracts, that you have the right clauses in there that follow along with the grant agreement. The civil rights compliance is also in there. This includes ensuring that any subrecipients also comply, and that specific contract language must be included, and that's all included in the award letter. So you'll be able to look at that.
Amy, a question in the chat.
Yep.
I read somewhere that it could cover back rent utilities payments, but no fines or late fees. Is that your interpretation as well?
I am not sure about that. I don't know, Tom, if you have any, and that's not coming to mind right now.
I believe that is correct, but I will confirm and then drop it into the chat.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
And then Tom also said in the chat that an obligation means an order placed for property and services and entering into contracts, subawards, and similar transactions that require a payment.
Thank you. Okay, just quickly, federal reporting requirements. So similar to what information had to be reported for financial information for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, I believe it's going to be very similar for ARP. So any grants, contracts, or direct payments greater than or equal to $50,000, you have to have all this information. So DUNS number, contract award number, award date, award amount, award description. So again, very similar to what we had to report for CRF, for the financial piece of it. There are also quite a few qualitative reporting requirements for these particular funds under the American Rescue Plan. Things like the goals of the project, the evidence base for the intervention, identify if the project will be primarily serving disadvantaged communities, key performance indicators, community engagement efforts undertaken, and then describe how the funds will be used to promote equitable delivery of government benefits and opportunities to underserved communities. So we will be at MMB in my COVID-19 Response Accountability Office will be asking for this information periodically. Also, when the request form was filled out initially, there was space to fill out this information as well. But if we don't have enough information, we'll be following up with you for that. Okay, so any questions on the American Rescue Plan overall before we move to the next section. Okay, if you think of some later, let me know. I also just want to point out that we do have the state has a new federal whistleblower policy. One of the requirements of ARP was to make sure we have this in place. And so it's posted on MMB's website. I have a link to it there. It prohibits reprisal if an employee reports mismanagement or waste of federal funds or abuse of power with respect to a federal contract. It also instructs employees to report complaints of reprisal to the U.S. Inspector General of the federal executive agency involved. And it's a joint MMB and admin policy. Okay, Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. I'm going to cover some procurement options you have for using those ARP dollars. And then I'm also going to share with you some strategies you can use to manage your contracts and make sure that we're efficiently and effectively spending these dollars. You can proceed to the next slide, Amy. So we know that there are going to be some challenges for procurement challenges for the ARP dollars. That time frame for spending ARP dollars is relatively small. It does really warm my heart that they have to be obligated, which means we could get that contract in place, but we're going to have the procurement done prior to that. There is lots of money coming to the state. That means there's going to be lots of needs for different agencies. So we're going to be really busy in the procurement office, and your procurement units will probably be quite busy as well. These are one-time funds, so it likely means that many of the dollars are going to be going out the door via contracting and purchasing. We want to use these dollars efficiently, and we want to have an impact. So we need to make smart, thoughtful choices about procurement. So we have some master contracts in place, and these are vendors that are already under competitive contract with terms and conditions. We have our MinSite program, and that is for IT staff augmentation and deliverables-based projects. So if you're doing anything with IT, MinSite might be a relatively quick stop for you to shop at for any IT needs. We can do deliverables and staff augmentation. Then we have data analytics, and that's a use of data analytics to make data-driven decisions. We have environmental services, and there's all kinds of different services that are available as part of this contract, like remediation, different kinds of studies, public engagement that relate to the environment. We also have temporary staffing for healthcare. So if your agency has needs for whether it be testing, vaccination, we have vendors on contract that can help with that. We also have a contract for temporary staffing for admin and professional services. And this is a contract where if you maybe need to do some staff augmentation in a certain area, even if you're maybe needing some extra folks to help you through the procurement and the actual contract management, you can find them on this contract. We also have an event management and logistics contract coming soon. And this is going to be for if you need to hold like a vaccination event or a testing event, they can coordinate that for you. And there's actually one more master contract that's going to be coming online in the near future, and that is one that's going to have specific testing options for state agencies for COVID-19. So those master contract is a pretty efficient way. The competitive procurement is mostly done. There'll be some direct select options and then also some kind of mini competitions in there, but relatively quick way to spend the dollars. Then there's agency joint ventures where you can work with another agency. I believe Amy mentioned earlier that housing finance maybe receive some specific money related to housing. Well, perhaps housing finance could partner with DHS and provide some housing supports. So like working together, you name both agencies on the RFP, make sure you define whether it is a single contract or one contract with each agency. And agencies need to decide how they'll work together, but that's a way to just leverage what different agencies are doing and work together. And you want to make sure that you are you're doing like communication, messaging, and working together well with that agency. We also have quick calls and equity selects. So this is a quick call is a short form solicitation. It's designed like an application for services. It's meant for $25,000 and under. You send to 3 vendors and you don't have to publicly post. An equity select is a contract that can go directly to a targeted group, economically disadvantaged, veteran-owned vendor with no posting for $25,000 and under. And both methods are great for increasing our diverse spend. So then this is a relatively new option. And we have done this with MnDOT, and we've won, both MnDOT and the Department of Administration have won awards for this program. But instead of listing super long requirements, you pose a problem to solve or a goal to meet. And it gives vendors an opportunity to propose a solution that meets the state needs. So we're kind of saying we don't know exactly what the answer is. Vendors, come to us with your ideas. This is a great opportunity to collaborate with other agencies. So if you have a similar mission with another agency, you're doing a similar project, it's a great partnership opportunity. It can be open continuously with multiple awards. So depending on, maybe you're awarding on an overall program, like I'll go back to that housing. We know that there's a lot of factors that go into providing housing. It's not simple as, building something and people will come to it. It's a lot more than that. So maybe that's an opportunity to collaborate with other agencies, whether it be like we need to have transit options near this housing, we need to have supports. So then you're bringing in DHS, Department of Transportation, and Housing Finance, all to kind of work on how to establish this, the program that you're working on. For instance, maybe the state is interested in solutions to reduce homelessness. Think about all the agencies that could play a role in that. That could be DHS, DPS. It could be, corrections, housing finance, all kinds of different opportunities to work together. We can do a detailed presentation if you are interested in doing a challenge-based RFP. This is something that you would have to work closely with the Office of State Procurement on. It's new, but it can be a really efficient way of spending dollars. I know Minnesota Department of Transportation has had great success and has made a number of awards off of their program. So now we're going to transition to when you actually have that contract in place. So contract management is really important. We mention it several times in state statutes. It's important to your project being successful overall. We can't just sign a contract and hope that everything goes as planned. We have taxpayer dollars that we're using. And these dollars we have a lot of potential to make an impact. So we want to make sure we're spending them wisely. We also want to make sure we're mitigating risk, and we're doing this efficiently. So state statutes that talk about contract management, we have 4 that I can name. So, and the commissioner is referring to Commissioner Department of Administration. Shall conduct all contracting by, for, and between agencies and perform all contract management and review functions. And we actually, agencies are supposed to cooperate with the commissioner in the creation, management, and oversight of state contracts. You, as a contracting agency, have the responsibility to diligently administer and monitor any contract that you enter into. And we always ask you in our professional technical certification form, in that form, how you are going to, what are the performance measures you're going to use and tools that you plan on use to monitor and evaluate the contractor performance. So project success. When we talk about project success in this presentation, we're talking about on time, on budget, with a satisfactory result. Most organizations have a 70% failure rate on the above definition. 64% of projects meet their goals. 17% of IT projects fail so badly they threaten the existence of a company. Only 28% of companies use project performance techniques. And then 75% of respondents state they believe their projects were doomed to fail from the beginning. So we're going to get you off on the right foot and provide you tools to get on the right foot. And all these organizations, 4PM, Reich, McKinsey and Company, they have programs where they're charging you on how to effectively monitor contracts. And we are here to give you the training for free. And we want you to, rather than 70% of you believing that your projects are doomed to fail, we'd much rather flip that around and have 70% of you like really believing that your projects are going to be successful and feel like you have the tools to be successful. So public dollars, on average, 1 in 6 projects see a budget overrun of 200%. On average, projects go 27% over budget. And the bigger your project is, the more money you're spending, the more likely it is to have a failure rate, which isn't good when those taxpayer dollars are at risk. And about 55% of projects overall are completed within budget. And we're going to not do the poll, so we can go to the next slide, Amy. So risk mitigation. So what risk mitigation essentially is, it's the alignment of your business strategy and your risk appetite to minimize the firm's exposure to large and unexpected losses. Your risk management capabilities need to be commensurate with the risks it expects to take. And on this slide, I have a picture of a race car driver. His name is Ayrton Senna, and he died tragically in a race car accident. And he was beloved in his home country of Brazil and really kind of well known in the Formula One racing community. And he had a lot of fans. And he died tragically on television, and lots of people saw that happen, and it was devastating to Formula One racing. And prior to that, I think something like, I mean, there were like a couple drivers killed every year, and it was just accepted that this happens. This is part of the sport. And they decided after this happened that they were going to take some steps to make sure it didn't happen again. And they addressed all operations of their business, from the engineering of the cars to the rules that they would establish during races. And since Ayrton Senna died, I think there's only been one accident, and it took 20 years to happen. They were able to completely turn it around. And I share this story because it's possible for us to mitigate risks. We don't have to start our projects thinking they're going to fail. We can take establish some strategies and methods to make sure that we are minimizing our risk and that we're setting our projects up for success. So efficiency, when we're talking about efficiency, we're talking about the effective uses of resource. When I'm talking about resources, it's our time, it's the dollars that we have available to us, it's our staff, and it's the extras, all the things that it takes to actually complete your project. And with these ARP dollars, we really have to be concerned about efficiency because of the narrow window we have to obligate that money. So we have to be really wise in the way we do procurement, and also wise in the way we manage these projects, so we are making sure that they get completed within our budget and on time. So project identification, this is one of the things that's going to help set you up for success. You need to know what your project purpose is. It's really important to understand who are your stakeholders, whose needs are you trying to meet, who has an interest in this project. You need to know what kind of resources are needed, financial, time, do you need staff, contractors, and who are your critical partners in getting this done. It's also valuable to know what similar projects have been undertaken. And then asking the question too, is the project necessary? Sometimes we start a project and we think we need to do it. We think we need to spend these dollars, and then we find out that maybe it's repetitive, or we can use existing resources. It's also really important to know what kind of change a project will bring, whether it's positive or negative. Just because change can really be difficult. It can be difficult for your stakeholders. It can be difficult for the people inside your agency. So communicating, especially if it's one of those negative changes, is really important. And just, you have to know who will be most affected by your project, and making sure that your project is going to meet those needs in the way that it should. So when we're talking about things, project scope, being on budget, on time, we have these three factors that they kind of play off one another. So we have quality, time, and cost. So sometimes when we know we need a high quality project, and it's really important that that quality be perfect. Maybe it's something that is public facing, then we know that it's probably going to take more time and cost more money to get that quality. And at the same time, if we have a very, very limited amount of time, we know that it's possible that the quality of our project could go down because we're doing it quickly. So what can we do? Is it possible to maybe throw some more resources like money at the project to ensure that we get a quality thing done in a certain amount of time? So as you're planning, thinking about how all these things work together and what your constraints are, and like which is most important to you. Ideally, they're all in balance, but in practice, it really works quite like that. Go to next slide. Oh, and there's my graphics. You can just click through those, Amy, and we'll go to the next slide. but that kind of shows the trade-offs that you have with each one of these things, and we want balance. So creating your scope of work, you want to be specific: who, what, where, and when. We want to be able to answer those questions, so we're not leaving anything to understanding. Understanding changes when parties change. So maybe the contractor has someone new in that role, and then they want to do things differently. You're used to doing it a certain way, and it's not defined in the contract. That can end up creating tension, and we have an issue. So it's best if you can define as much as possible in that contract. You also want to build success criteria and standards of completion into the scope of work. How do we know that something is done according to like what we need? So what does that look like? What does a quality product look like? You want to build monitoring tools into the scope of work, and we'll talk about the monitoring tools in later slides. It's also really important to understand the contract terms. So termination, retainage, invoices, payment, what do those things like mean, and how do they influence your project? So contract management keys. So what is contract management? It's establishing expectations. So what are the expectations that you have for the contractor? It's maintaining communication channels. And it's not just maintaining communication channels with the contractor, it's maintaining them internally as well. It's processing your contracting documentation. So when you get an invoice, are you checking to make sure that it is itemized and there is, you can tell what the contractor did for what they're charging you in that invoice. It's assessing performance. So it's kind of looking, did the contractor do what they were supposed to do according to the way we needed it? It's managing risk, managing change, and it's ensuring quality, that we're getting a quality work product on behalf of the state. So establishing deliverables. A deliverable is the project outcome. And I think we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about what is that final deliverable that we're, what's our goal? What are we trying to get? But we also have to think more than about those project deliverables, those specific unique outcomes based on our specific unique needs. So that's the product, the process, the plan, the policy, the ultimate outcome. But then there's process deliverables. And that's how we're going to get to the project deliverable. So maybe it's a business case. It's maybe a more detailed scope of work. It's a governance plan. We don't want to just focus on the final deliverable, but what we need to get there. What needs to happen in the beginning, middle, and end of your contract for success? And what do you need to know? What do you need to receive to know your project is on track? So the role of the contract manager. So in statute, we are supposed to assign a specific personnel to manage each contract. And this person needs to understand the contract. They need to communicate openly with the program manager and contractor. They need to maintain the contract file. They need to review and validate the contract management plan, which we'll talk about in greater detail. They should monitor progress and performance. They're verifying deliverables, receiving invoices, and managing change. Then we have a program manager. And this person is responsible for the technical knowledge and oversight. They are generally the day-to-day contact for the contractor. They maintain open communications with the contract manager. They monitor progress and performance. They also should understand the contract. They should be reporting any technical failures to the contract manager. They're reviewing invoices. They're reporting inaccurate invoices to the contract manager. They're communicating needed changes to the contract manager, and they're following that contract management plan. So when we're talking about a contract manager and a program manager, sometimes at the state, these people, they might serve in both roles and be one person. It might be two separate people. But it's just key to know that regardless of whether it's one role or two roles, that all of these roles need to be fulfilled. You need somebody that is managing the contract and also making sure that we're getting a technical product that is acceptable. I worked on the state's disparity study. I was in the role of the contract manager. And I sort of became a technical expert along the way, but I wasn't in the very beginning. So I had to work with the technical experts to make sure that the product we were getting was actually quality, because as a contract manager, I wasn't necessarily the best judge of that. So that you want to make sure you have both roles. You should always have a kickoff meeting, and this is an internal meeting that I'm talking about, and it should be led by the contract manager. And that's where everybody reviews the contract and they understand it. You're discussing expectations and responsibilities for the key stakeholders and the people in the room. You want to review your communication structure. And I don't think contractors always mean badly when they do this, but they do this thing that I call answer shopping. Sometimes they really want to get something done for us, or they want to do it a certain way, and they're looking for somebody to tell them how to do that. So they will go around and they'll ask questions until they hear the answer that they want. And when they hear that answer, they will do what they want. So what's best is if they go to someone and they understand, I don't actually have the authority to make this decision. I need to go speak to the program manager to find out if this is acceptable. Then I'll get back to you. So you want people to know who the decision makers are and who can make what kind of decisions. And that gets to the authority of the different parties. So maybe you have somebody that's kind of a day-to-day subject matter expert, but they're not necessarily going to be making really important decisions about like when something is due or how something should be done. You want to talk about security issues, and it's really important that everybody on that's involved with the contract is aware of what the security issues are and what happens when that comes up. Because if we have something that relates to, private health information, personally identifiable information, we have certain obligations and we need to act quickly. So if that issue comes up, make sure you have that established. You want to talk about change procedures. We know that change happens and what happens when it does. So, if somebody is fulfilling a certain role, they leave, we want somebody to be able to kind of pick up where they left off. You want to go over your key documents. So that might be your contract management plan, a quality assurance plan, and your risk management plan. And then the timelines, you want to discuss those. What are your critical deliverables? When are they due? Everyone involved with the project should know what those deliverables are and know those critical deadlines. So I've talked about a contract management plan a few times. This is a document to guide you through managing a contract from beginning to end. This is a living document. It should change as a project develops. It's an internal document. This is meant for your internal team. The contractor doesn't need to see it and maybe possibly shouldn't necessarily see it. But it ensures that everyone understands and agrees on what needs to be done, who's going to do it, and how and when implementation will be delivered. It should identify the project team along with roles and responsibilities. It should have key background information about your project. So for instance, when we're identifying the project team along with roles and responsibilities, after this training, I'll email the team that takes us kind of a sample contract management plan and a template. And also there's one that I have like filled out, and I use the example of a human resources project because I think that's something that most people can kind of understand and grasp from agency to agency, but it's it's a plan to kind of hire and retain talent. And there's Peter, he's a program manager, and I envision him as a director of a division who's the ultimate decision maker. But then there's some other people in there that are identified that the contractor will work. One of them is called Holly Resources, and I envision that as a supervisor who has a lot of day-to-day technical knowledge, but is not the decision maker. So you're defining that within the contract management plan. And you're giving key background information. Like, it's always important to remember why. Why are we embarking on this project? What's the goal? And to keep that in mind. You're identifying important dates, like the effective date, the end date, and any important milestones. Basic things like the contract number, it sounds like, I shouldn't need to say that, but sometimes we have a lot of trouble like finding that information when we need it. Contract monitoring procedures. So how are we going to monitor progress? How do we know that the contractor is doing something? And you can do things like comparing the scope of work to the deliverables received, status reports from the contractor. You can compare expenditures versus your budget. So you can see we're in phase 1 and we spent 98% of the dollars for phase 1 and we're 95% of the way complete. So that tells you that you're slightly over budget and you might need to address that with the contractor. We're identifying risk, and then we're using a risk management strategy. And identifying risk, we don't do that consistently for every single project, more than likely, but it's really important that we do it on the big ones, especially, or anything that is like mission critical and public facing. We really want to have an understanding of those risks and making sure we have a plan to manage them. So I'm going to talk about some monitoring tools that you can use to monitor your contracts. So this is the standard desk review. We really should be doing this for every single contract. So we're reviewing reports and documentation from the contract so you can compare your invoices to your contract milestones, compare that expenditure to your budget, compare performance to the contract requirements. And then you can also keep quarter to quarter performance metrics so you can see like while they were on budget, on time, consistently, quarter one, quarter two, but then quarter three, they're starting to slip. Do we need to address it? Contractor reports. There's two main reports that we're generally asking for asking contractors to give us. One is a status report. This should track the scope of work and organization and content. So if you have defined your project into phases, which I highly recommend, you should see that they completed phase one, and these are the tasks that they completed. It's going to describe the status of scope of work items. So it might be like started, not started, completed, pending, all kinds of words that like let you know whether like what's happening, and it lets you know what the contractor's working at. You want to see what's complete versus what is pending. And it should also note any unresolved issues. So when I mentioned that I worked on the disparity study, we had some agencies and entities that were having a really hard time getting their data to the contractor, which could have resulted in delays. And we didn't want delays because we had to spend that money in a certain time frame, which is something that we're all probably going to be in those positions with the ARP dollars. So an unresolved issue was we weren't unable to get data from XYZ entities. So we had a conversation about that. What do we need to do to get this data? And we worked together to resolve that. Then there is an activity report. This describes what the contractor is doing. And it also can be used to confirm what they are not doing. So for example, when we hired a disparity study vendor, I expect that vendor to be an expert on disparity studies. That is why we hired them. So I don't expect to see that they are kind of reading, basic like statistics textbook. That's not what we're paying them to do. They should have that expertise. And it also can like indicate to you that, wow, like we're in phase two and they are still working on phase one things. And that could be a cause for concern and indication that there could be a delay. It should provide dates and length of time spent on various activities. And it's really important to know that activity is not necessarily progress. So just because you see them doing something doesn't mean that it's something of value for your project. So if you're seeing like the same thing, like, gosh, it is taking you 32 hours to do this really kind of basic task, that's something for you to question and say, hey, why are we spending this much time? I'm concerned about the budget, and this isn't necessarily what we expected. So these are metrics that at least I saw them almost every day in the times that I was going to and from the office. And I have to admit, I'm not in my car quite as much now, but they tell us something about our vehicles. We have a gas gauge that tells us how far we can go before we need to fill up. We have the tachometer, which it's in that 8,000 RPM area. That probably means your car is suffering and you should probably get it to a mechanic as soon as possible. We have a check engine light. That check engine light, some of us know that when that comes on, it might mean some computer issue with your car, or it could mean something really serious. You probably don't need to get to a mechanic right away, but you might want to do that soon. Then we have our speedometer, which tells us, lets us know whether we're following the law and staying within the speed limits. So they're all telling us about something about our cars and maybe something about the health of our vehicle. And they're telling us what our vehicle maybe can and can't do at a given moment. And we need to think about these as key performance indicators. What do we need to know whether our contract is in good health, and what our contractors can do and can't do for us? So we should establish, I think Amy mentioned that, we should have key performance indicators for grants. Maybe that's a special requirement, but I think we should have them for contracts too. They're important. And they are things that should relate to the contract. They should be measurable. They have to be things within the contractor's control. I mentioned that issue with the disparity study where the vendor was having trouble getting entities to give them data that they needed. Um, that really wasn't within the contractor's control. And we had to go through some special steps and schedule time for the contractor to go to the agency to help them extract that data. They went above and beyond. That was very nice of them, but it really wasn't within their control. They needed some special permission and some buy-in from the state. So that's not something we would measure them on. It has to be within their control. But we use them to determine how the contractor is performing and really how healthy our contract is. So we can have minimum service standards. If it's maybe a contractor that's helping us run a program and they're doing meeting facilitation, we can ask people participating in the meeting, what is the quality of this? We can ask them to rate it. The alignment of budget and expenditures is important. We want to make sure that our contract is staying within our budget. We can measure the number of customer complaints. We can look at the accuracy of invoices. We know it's a real pain when you get an invoice that you don't understand, that doesn't make any sense. Adherence to timelines and schedules. So these are all things that you can do in that packet that I'll email to everyone in this training. You'll see some recommended KPIs for different kinds of contracts, because what we're using for a consultant looks very maybe different from what we'd ask an engineer to do. I don't think we have the right thing enabled to play this video, but the reason we share this, does it work? Because we don't actually need to see the sound. Okay, so it's working. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. So I'll have you watch this video. So the reason we share this video is when you're really focused on maybe one particular thing, you miss other things. And that's really gets to the importance of your team and making sure that you have different people looking at different parts of your contract. I'm no financial expert, and I don't like reviewing invoices. It's not my favorite thing to do. I can't always tell whether they're billing the correct way, but somebody on the finance team is going to be pretty good at that. Your technical experts are the ones that should be telling you whether the deliverables are up to standard. And you need multiple people generally to make sure that your contract's successful and make sure people understand their roles and what they're supposed to be watching for. So here are the factors that you need to be successful. So here, when we're missing our focus, that's an issue. Instead, we want to have clear business objectives. We want to know what our goal is, and I'll be working towards that goal. Content issues. That's sometimes when we don't know exactly what we want and our requirements are not defined very well. So we need to have well-defined requirements. And sometimes, in the RFP phase, well-defined requirements are like we have to think about them differently. You know, we want to leave some room in the RFP phase for the vendor to tell us what they're going to do. But in the contract phase, we need to have those requirements ironed out and really be firm about what the contractor should be doing. Skill issues. So we want appropriately defined skill levels and team alignment. And one of the issues you can run into is, so the contractor will tell us that they're going to, you know, they'll propose some very important person that does very important work and has a ton of experience. And we expect that person to be working on our project. And then they send somebody that is actually doesn't have the same qualifications and isn't as good. And that's not why we maybe selected the contractor. And that's a problem. We want to make sure that we have people with the right skills doing the different tasks on the contract. And there's a flip side of that where there are some tasks that we really probably don't want the most expensive person that they have working on, and that it's more appropriate for someone else in their organization to be working on. So those are things to watch for. And then execution issues. You want to have a realistic schedule. We have to live in reality, which means kind of being aware of our own staff constraints. And, you know, if we're pushing really hard for the contractor to get something done quickly, sometimes we miss out on that quality piece. And then sometimes, you know, we just have to be aware of like what happens at the state, like when we have fiscal year end. You know, it's probably not a great time to plan your project wrap up at fiscal year end if you can avoid it, because we all end up really busy often at that time of year. So communication, whenever we have someone come to us with a contract management issue, it is almost always rooted in some form of communication. So you want to have a communication plan. You want to establish who those decision makers are, and then classifying potential contract issues into minor versus major and designate who can handle each one. So minor problems can be resolved with maybe a phone call or email. And I'll go back to the disparity study. I had somebody call and complain to me that they didn't think the contractor was doing the greatest job on communication and they were a little frustrated. That was something that I could resolve with a contractor and said, hey, this agency is a little disappointed in the communication. Next time include me and let's like work together to make sure we get this communication, you know, in a better place. And a major problem is one that impacts the needs of the state or substantially affects contract performance, and it requires a meeting and in-person follow-up. I would say the data issue, the data was at the heart of what the contractor was doing, analyzing that data. So when they didn't have it, it had a lot of potential to impact our project and to slow it down. So that's something that we got together and we problem solved and figured out how we were going to get that data when we needed it. So that was a major problem that involved a meeting and more people than just, you know, me and the contractor having a conversation. Let's skip this one, Amy. So documentation, if it is not documented, it doesn't exist. So that's, you know, kind of a principle that we operate under. So if you tell a contractor to do something verbally, it's not in the contract, and then they don't do it, it's really hard to establish that we have a problem. Versus, you know, maybe you have a conversation with the contractor and say, hey, we really needed this at this time and we didn't get it. What can we do to make sure that we get this deliverable? Then you establish a plan. So then you send an email. Per our conversation, I understand that we'll be getting this data by this date, and this is what we're going to do to get it. Then you have it in writing and you shoot it off to the contract manager and it becomes part of the file. So if they don't live up to that expectation, we have something to point to. So that's when that verbal communication should be followed up with an email or memo. And I have to emphasize how important the verbal communication is. If you're entirely just like shooting emails and paper back and forth between the vendor, that isn't always good. It's important to have conversations. And it makes you feel more like partners and that we're working towards the same thing. And then you can also detect things in a conversation that you just can't detect in an email. But we want to follow that up with an email or a memo. This stuff provides proof of non-performance and contract claims. So if we go down the road where we want to terminate, we have backup and we can point to things and say, this is why we're terminating. This is why the state is owed this. We have a paper trail and it's ideally kept in one place, and that's managed by the contract manager. Risk mitigation. So establishing risk factors for the project. And usually our biggest risks, I think, relate over data and making sure that we're keeping data secure. But it's past performance issues, disputes that might come up, delays, and budget. Delays is another one that I would say is a risk factor for a project, especially when we're trying to spend these ARP dollars efficiently. You should categorize your risk based on impact and probability. So how likely is this to happen? Like a data breach is something that would have a huge impact, but it might be pretty low probability. Whereas something like a delay is maybe it's not our hugest risk, but there's a high possibility of it happening. So we want to understand that. Something that is a high possibility of happening and is also a major impact, you're really going to want to have a risk management strategy that is thorough and that you're prepared to take on that issue if it comes up. And you're going to outline a process and how to address and deal with it. You're going to identify processes for unforeseen conditions, authority and process to make change, dispute resolution, and breach. And the thing too that to be like a little bit careful of with risk mitigation, I am a lawyer, so I can make lawyer jokes, but it's like sometimes lawyers have a tendency to like think of every little thing that could possibly happen. That's really not necessarily the goal. We want to really focus on those risks that are high probability and or high impact. So those are the ones that are that we should direct our most attention to. So decision-making traps to avoid. So these are things that they become a trap when our desire to be consistent overrules critical new information. So there's a familiarity trap, failing to remain vigilant when faced with the known. So we've done this before. It's no big deal, even though you're maybe noticing a few things here and there that are off. And you're not paying attention to those because you've done this before. Social facilitation. So everyone is doing it, so it must be okay. I'm going to use the concept of contract management or not managing the contract actually. So no one really pays a lot of attention. It doesn't manage contracts. So it must be an okay practice. When you're kind of seeing signs that your contract requires maybe some more heavy-handed management. The expert halo. So this is when somebody is in the room and they have a lot of information and they know this subject really, really well. And they're okay with it, so everyone else should, even though you maybe know something that is really giving you pause and like you don't speak up because someone else is an expert. This is a big one, consistency. So every time we take a step and move forward, it's harder to turn back around and fix something. So it's like we need to keep this project moving. And every time you do that without addressing the issue, it can be harder to address down the road because issues tend to snowball. Scarcity, our time and budget are too limited to address this, so we're just going to move on and we're just going to hope that things work out. Then there's the acceptance, peer pressure, like everyone else in the room wants to move forward, so I'm just going to acquiesce and go with the crowd. So just know that those things could happen, and when they do, you don't want to overrule that critical new information. You want to address it. We can go to next slide. Managing change. We know that change happens. Establish what the change process is. If we're ever adjusting our total obligation and we're majorly moving around, like when tasks happen, we might need an amendment. We can also do, if you have a change order process built into your contract, there's possibility of moving things like within your scope where you're not adjusting the bottom line of the contract or like the ultimate deadlines, you're just adjusting tasks. But who gets to decide when change happens? Who decides when there's an amendment? Who decides when we're going to adjust that scope of work? You want to establish that. And then you want to know what the impact is and how we need to react. So you want to use your contract monitoring tools. And you want to know your risk and make sure the change addresses the risk. So if you're, you have to adjust the deadline of the contract because maybe there's been some delays. Know what the risks are and see if there's maybe another way, some other part of the contract you can maybe speed up or reduce in order to not make that delay too impactful. And internal change. So these are the things that happen inside our organizations that affect projects. So be aware of the kinds of changes that impact. So maybe it's retirement, maybe it's someone on your team is leaving soon, but change is inevitable, so plan and document. I didn't start managing the disparity study, somebody else did. But I worked closely with that person the entire time. So when he moved on to a different agency, I was able to just step into his shoes and continue the project. It was fairly seamless, which is a good thing, but it doesn't always work like that. So it's, important. I think redundancies are really important. So just, not having your project really rely on one person. There's usually a whole team that makes a project successful. And being proactive versus reactive. So if you're getting the news that somebody on your team is going to retire in 2 to 3 months, and that's going to be really difficult on the team, start planning for it and start creating those redundancies if they don't exist. And it's really important when change happens that we're engaging and communicating. When this happens, teams need proactive leaders to guide them through the change. And even though, when this person left for another agency, I was kind of like freaking out inside. It was really important to kind of have that brave face for the rest of the team, because they need that to make sure it tells them that everything's okay and we're going to get through this. So positive feedback, it's really important to communicate what's going well, and it gives the contractor an indication of the expected standards. I think sometimes we are really quick to give the redirecting feedback, the negative feedback, but the positive is important as well. It can motivate and boost performance. It fosters open communication. It starts the contractor starts feeling like you're more of a partner when you're telling them, this is going really well. Thank you, I appreciate it. You should be specific though. It can be a simple thank you. Wow, that report was really thorough and detailed. It gave us a really great roadmap of what we need to do next. We appreciate it. Thank you. That can make a real difference. So when things go wrong, and this is when we get to talk more about that redirecting feedback, when things are maybe not on the greatest path. So there's minor contract problems that come up. It might be a missed non-critical deliverable. So maybe that you wanted them to do a more detailed scope of work, and it's a little bit late, but you can still stay on track because you have that overall scope of work. It might be a difficult invoice, missed email that they didn't respond to you, a few spelling and grammatical errors. Deliverables are late by an insubstantial amount of time. You want to review the facts, and you want to determine if the state contributed. I mentioned that data issue. That was on the state. It was not the contractor's fault that the people were not getting him the data that they needed on time. But you should follow established communication procedures, seek resolution with contractor, and document the issue, and then follow up in the time period that you establish with the contractor. So major contract problems. We're missing critical deliverables. The project is off budget and scheduled by substantial amounts. Critical deliverables are not in good shape. Repetitive and unresolved minor issues. I mentioned on that last slide that we have to document even these little issues, because when they keep on happening, that's a signal that maybe there's bigger issues and they can snowball. Unacceptable timelines for resolution. So you want to review the facts, determine if the state contributed, follow your communication plan. You want to evaluate your risk and determine the severity of issues. Document and communicate issue to vendor. And you want to review your remedies. You want to understand what's available to you if things do not go on track. I had an agency that had a mission critical contract that was not going well. They could tell from the very beginning that there were some little things that gave them pause. They documented them. And it turned out that those little things, there were bigger things down the road that happened. But because that agency was so good at documenting everything that had gone on, when the time came for us to terminate, we were able to part ways in a fairly easy and straightforward manner. It was not a surprise to the contractor. And it, resulted in we didn't have to disrupt services, which we really did not want to do. But it's because that contract, they followed this. They dealt with the major contract problems and the minor ones and documented. Remedies to major problems. You can withhold payment on unsatisfactory deliverables. We do not pay for things that are not acceptable. So it's just, even though that contract really wants their money for the deliverable, it should be done well before we pay them. You can reach out to Office of State Procurement for negotiation assistance. We can help you. Often this is it's a negotiation with the vendor, what this remedy might be. You can do vendor performance reports, which is kind of a formal process that indicates to the contractor that something is not right, that we need to fix. You can do a formal letter outlining deficiencies and request to remedy by a specific date. So if you take and you write, sometimes you're writing emails back and forth. Well, if you maybe change it up a little and write a formal letter on agency letterhead and attach it to the email, that indicates to the contractor that, okay, they're pretty serious about dealing with this issue. If you're doing a formal breach, you want to work with Office of State Procurement or your general counsel. Same with contract cancellation. We really want to do this correctly, and we don't want to cause further issues. So that's when it's probably time to involve some lawyers.
Rachel, can I ask a question on that first bullet? So withholding payment for unsatisfactory deliverables. So what if it's unsatisfactory, and in order to do, to bring it up to satisfactory levels, they have to put in a whole bunch more time and effort to it, and they try to charge for that? Like, have you ever run across that situation, and should the state have to pay for that?
That is a tricky issue, and I'm actually dealing with it in an agency that's having that issue right now, where like things did not necessarily go as planned and the contractor had to spend a lot more time. And it goes back to that original proposal and what they proposed. And they maybe said, like, we'll go back to my data extraction issue. And the contractor said, well, this is going to cost, the data extraction, dealing with the data should cost $2,000. But then it turns out that the state has a complicated system that we did not communicate adequately to the contractor, so they were not able to actually ascertain what it would take. And it took them 10, 15 more hours because of the difficulty that we didn't communicate. So that's where it's always important to see where the state plays a role. But sometimes contractors do what I call underbidding, and they're overly optimistic. And that's a risk that they take. If we've given them the information they need to be successful, it's like if you get something that is full of grammatical errors and spelling errors, that should be absolutely on them to like fix and address and deal with. That's on them. So I think that's where it's important to sort out who's playing a role, and why isn't it getting done on time or according to specifications.
So the answer is it depends.
It depends. It's like, that's what most lawyers answer to everything, right? It depends.
That's right.
So when the state is a problem, so I just kind of mentioned how sometimes the state does contribute. Sometimes we are not giving them enough information about the scope in the initial RFP phase. You want to work with a contractor and determine where the breakdowns are occurring, which is kind of what I just mentioned, in that issue, like, why is this data so much harder? Why is it taking longer? And answering that question. And working with the vendor to resolve. One thing that I can't recommend enough doing on your contracts is like, we put our RFP out there with what we think our scope of work is. Then the contractor comes and they quote unquote open up the hood, and they maybe see more complications than the state did. So you can have them do an initial scope of work, and then you can establish a more detailed scope of work down the road after they've been able to open up that hood and see, and you'll have a more realistic picture of what things are going to cost you. And that's kind of a negotiation thing we're happy to help you with. But sometimes, like, we are actually the problem ourselves. It happens. It can be, there's negativity, things haven't gone well, and the team is not feeling very positive about the project. And maybe because we're not feeling positive, we end up disengaged. You naturally, like, it's, you don't always want to deal with things that are hard. And that's what, and that's when we get to passive leadership. We don't want to deal with things that are hard, so we just kind of hope things will resolve themselves. Sometimes the state is micromanaging, and when we're micromanaging, we hired a contractor to do a job. To some degree, we should be able to tell them to go do it and come back to us with a deliverable and expect a good deliverable. But when we're like constantly second guessing the contractor, that can lead to relationship issues, and they don't like really feel like they're empowered to do what we're asking. Sometimes there's internal conflict in teams. We haven't really established whose role is what, and maybe there's people that don't necessarily agree, and that's impacting the team. And then the overall like lack of resources. Sometimes we just don't have the bandwidth, and that can be a really difficult situation. But here's the thing, we'll go to the next slide. There are ways to fix this stuff. We can get things back on track. The key is like engagement. And it's really important that the team stay engaged, and this is within our control. So modeling great leadership. So communicating, collaborating, connecting, and committing to the purpose behind your contract. So it might be that we need to have a meeting and we have to understand why this project is important and go back to what our goals are and committing to that goal. Maybe the team needs to feel included. Maybe they're feel like they're just along for the ride and that's why they're disengaged. What can we do to empower them to be part of the solution? And the team needs to see their leaders enthusiastic about success and what success means. And I think it's really important when we have failures that we communicate them and we own them and that we get a little vulnerable and to say, hey, we messed this up, but there's a way to get back on track. And you're all part of the solution. But really it's about committing to the purpose behind this project. So, it's like maybe you're halfway through, it's feeling like a long slog. And that's a time to get everybody back together and kind of reestablish expectations and commit once again to the purpose behind your project. So rules of the road, regular contract monitoring keeps minor problems from turning into major ones. Appropriately identifying and addressing problems is an opportunity to set your contract up for success. Repeat problems and a lack of resolution are indications that stronger methods of management may be necessary. So it's like when I talked about the contract that we had to cancel. And that was an issue where the repeat problems were really indicative that we needed to be more engaged and stronger methods of management and follow up on that particularly contract. Don't let problems fester. They snowball. They don't really ever get away. They just tend to get bigger. So address them promptly and reach out for help. Sometimes these conversations are hard to have. We've had hard conversations at Office of State Procurement with vendors, and we're willing to help you have those tough conversations if you're feeling, if you don't feel confident. But know your bottom lines and when it is time to move on. And that's something that when I go back to that contract that had to be canceled, they knew what their bottom line was and they knew when they wanted to move on. And that was really helpful that they had that information and kind of understood that they needed to, a different solution. So available tools. We have negotiations assistance from the Office of State Procurement, and that's Charles Sutter. He actually goes by Pete, but that's his email address, and he will respond to generally Charles or Pete. Vendor performance reports, breach and termination. And if you're doing this, it's best to reach out to Office of State Procurement. Withhold retainage. So that's our leverage at the end of the contract. We don't pay for incomplete or unsatisfactory deliverables. And you also can engage with additional contacts and leadership within the company. So maybe it's someone above that person. It's just like, hey, we've been working with this person and things are not going well. This isn't what we expected. What can we do to get on track? And with that, I think that concludes our training. I want to thank you so much for bearing with us, and I hope this is helpful. I will email those tools out after this training. Any questions?
Thank you. This was very helpful.
Yeah, we don't do many contracts. We do mostly grants, but so much of this information still applies and you put it together really nicely. So thank you. It was good.
You're welcome. And just as a reminder, the grant agreement and the civil rights stuff for ARP is in the chat. So you can take a copy of that if you don't already have it, just so you understand, some of the provisions that need to be in subrecipient grant contracts or other contracts. So feel free to take that. If you need another copy, just feel free to let me know.
And I could probably put that stuff right in the chat where people can grab it.
Yep, I think I've already got it actually, because that's something that's in our grants program guidelines all the time. So speaking of the program guidelines are what we attach to grant agreements with all the federal requirements. And so I've been reviewing all these documents to see what's in there and what's not compared to our usual ones. Is that something you might want to review, or should we just do the best we can and carry on?
What do you think, Rachel?
Sorry, I was having trouble on mute. Could you repeat the question? I was actually trying to find the documents that I could
Sure.
pop in the chat.
Sure.
Not
So
good
we
at
get most of
multitasking.
our federal funding through the Department of Justice. So they have their usual special conditions. So I've been reading through all of this ARP stuff to try and figure out what theirs are. And I think I've got most of them, but there's just a few that we usually see in ours, like that imminent breach of personally identifiable information, or eligibility to work with minors, that are in our usual justice language, our conditions, but I don't see attached to these funds. So I'm putting together these program guidelines, and I'm wondering if any of you want to review those, or should we just carry on with doing the best we can?
I think for the most part, if you've included them before, it can't hurt to include it again, as long as it doesn't conflict with anything that you have to absolutely do with the ARP funds.
Okay.
So, you may want to reach out and just like have us help you determine whether there's a conflict. But it's like, I'd rather include it than not. If
Okay,
it
so
doesn't
rather be
conflict.
more restrictive than less. Okay, we can do that. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll take a look at the recording just to make sure everything worked okay. And then if that looks good, we will pass that on as well, because I know there were some people from public safety that were not able to attend today. So we'll make sure to do that. Thanks for being our pilot audience on the training. If you have any other suggestions or comments afterwards, feel free to let us know.
All
Thank
righty,
you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Were you gonna say something, Rachel?
Just gonna say thank you.
Okay,
Hope this is helpful.
all right. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.